The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla adjusted her pearl necklace one final time before stepping out onto the terrace. Today was supposed to be a quiet family gathering, a rare moment of normalcy in the otherwise regimented royal schedule. The annual summer garden party for extended family members had been planned for months, and Camilla had personally overseen every detail from the flower arrangements to the menu selection. Princess Charlotte, now 10 years old and growing more confident by the day, had been looking forward to this event for weeks. She had specifically requested to wear her new blue dress with white flowers, the one that reminded her of the dresses her late grandmother Diana used to wear. Charlotte had seen the photographs countless times in the royal archives, and something about connecting with that legacy made her feel special and grown up. As the morning progressed, guests began arriving at the castle grounds. Distant cousins, family friends, and various dignitaries made their way through the security checkpoints, each eager to spend time with the working royals in a more relaxed setting. The atmosphere was festive, with string quartet music drifting across the lawns and the gentle clinking of fine china as afternoon tea was prepared. Camilla moved gracefully between groups of guests, making conversation and ensuring everyone felt welcome. She had worked hard over the years to find her place within the royal family, and events like these were opportunities for her to demonstrate her commitment to the institution. Every gesture was measured, every word carefully chosen to reflect the dignity and tradition of the monarchy. Charlotte, meanwhile, was reveling in the attention she was receiving from visiting relatives. Several elderly aunts had commented on how much she resembled her grandmother Diana, praising her poise and natural charm. The young princess beamed with pride, standing a little taller with each compliment. She moved between adult conversations with the confidence of someone who had been raised in the spotlight, yet still maintained the innocent curiosity of childhood. The castle's head gardener had spent weeks preparing the grounds for this event. Every hedge was perfectly trimmed, every flower bed meticulously maintained. The rose garden, in particular, was in spectacular bloom, with varieties dating back centuries creating a tapestry of colors and fragrances that seemed almost magical. It was here that Charlotte found herself drawn as the afternoon wore on, enchanted by the beauty and tranquility of the space. As Charlotte explored the garden paths, she came across a section that had been roped off for maintenance. A sign clearly indicated that guests should not enter this area, as recent plantings were delicate and the ground was still soft from irrigation work. The restriction seemed minor, almost invisible among the grandeur of the overall setting, but it would soon become the catalyst for an unexpected confrontation. The young princess paused at the rope barrier, looking longingly at a particular rosebush that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. The flowers were a deep crimson color, more vibrant than any she had seen before. Without really thinking about the consequences, she ducked under the rope and stepped onto the soft earth, drawn by the beauty of the restricted garden section. What Charlotte didn't realize was that this particular area held special significance for Camilla. The Queen Consort had personally worked with the gardening staff to create a memorial section dedicated to various members of the royal family, including a special tribute to King Charles's environmental initiatives. The plantings represented months of careful planning and considerable expense, and any damage could undo weeks of delicate cultivation work. A groundskeeper noticed Charlotte's transgression almost immediately and quickly approached the area, unsure of how to handle the delicate situation. Protocol dictated that he should not directly correct a member of the royal family, but his responsibility for the gardens was clear. He hesitated, looking around for guidance, when one of the security guards noticed the situation developing. The guard, a veteran of royal protection with over 15 years of experience, understood the complexity of the moment. He had seen countless situations where protocol and practicality collided, and he knew that handling this incident correctly would require both diplomacy and firmness. His training had taught him to anticipate problems before they escalated, and he could sense that this seemingly minor issue had the potential to become something much larger. Meanwhile, Camilla had been engaged in an animated conversation with a group of garden club presidents who had been invited as special guests. They were discussing sustainable gardening practices and the royal family's commitment to environmental stewardship when she noticed a commotion developing near the restricted garden area. Her expression shifted subtly from pleasant social engagement to focused concern as she realized that Charlotte had ventured into the off-limits section. The timing couldn't have been worse. Several photographers had been granted limited access to document the garden party, and Camilla knew that any perceived family discord would be scrutinized intensely by the media. The royal family had worked hard to maintain an image of unity and stability, especially in recent years when various controversies had challenged public perception of the monarchy. Charlotte, oblivious to the growing attention her actions were attracting, continued to admire the roses in the restricted area. She reached out to touch one of the blooms, marveling at the velvet texture of the petals. In her mind, she was simply appreciating the beauty of her family's gardens, never imagining that her innocent exploration would soon trigger a chain of events that would test the patience and composure of the royal household. The security guard moved closer, weighing his options carefully. Direct intervention with a royal family member required extreme delicacy, but allowing the situation to continue unchecked could result in damage to the carefully maintained garden space. He had witnessed Queen Camilla's dedication to these grounds over the years and understood how much this memorial garden project meant to her personally. Other guests began to notice the developing situation, and conversations gradually shifted from polite social chatter to whispered observations about what was happening near the rose garden. The string quartet continued playing, but there was an undercurrent of tension beginning to build as more people became aware that something unusual was occurring. Camilla excused herself from her conversation with the garden club members, maintaining her composure but moving with purposeful determination toward the restricted area. Her years of royal training had taught her to handle unexpected situations with grace, but this particular incident struck at something more personal than protocol. The memorial garden represented her attempt to honor the royal family's legacy while contributing something meaningful of her own. As she approached the rope barrier, Camilla could see that Charlotte had now moved deeper into the restricted section, seemingly fascinated by a particular arrangement of plants that surrounded a small commemorative plaque. The young princess appeared completely absorbed in her exploration, unaware of the growing tension her presence in the forbidden area was creating among the adults watching from various vantage points around the garden. The security guard positioned himself strategically, ready to intervene if necessary but hoping that the situation could be resolved quietly through family channels. His experience had taught him that royal family dynamics often played out in ways that standard protocol couldn't fully address, and he understood that his role was to protect both the individuals involved and the integrity of the institution they represented. What happened next would challenge everyone's understanding of royal protocol and family relationships, setting the stage for a confrontation that would reveal the complex pressures and expectations that define life within the British monarchy. The beautiful garden setting, which had seemed so peaceful and welcoming just moments before, was about to become the backdrop for an incident that would test the limits of patience, propriety, and family loyalty. Queen Camilla's footsteps grew more deliberate as she approached the roped-off garden section where Princess Charlotte continued her unauthorized exploration. The queen consort's face maintained its public composure, but those who knew her well could detect the subtle tension in her shoulders and the slight compression of her lips that indicated growing displeasure. Years of royal training had taught her to control her expressions, but the current situation was testing those carefully developed skills. Charlotte remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her actions. She had discovered a small memorial stone embedded among the rose bushes, and her natural curiosity compelled her to examine the engraved inscription more closely. The stone bore the dates of significant environmental milestones in royal history, part of Camilla's carefully planned tribute to sustainable practices that had taken months to design and implement. The security guard, whose name was Thomas Whitfield, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His radio crackled softly with communications from other security personnel who had noticed the developing situation, but protocol prevented him from taking direct action without explicit authorization. Thomas had served in royal protection for most of his career, and he had never encountered a situation quite like this one, where family dynamics and institutional responsibilities intersected so directly. Several guests had now gathered at a respectful distance, pretending to admire other aspects of the garden while secretly observing the unfolding drama. The elderly aunts who had earlier praised Charlotte's resemblance to Princess Diana now watched with concern, recognizing that the young princess might be stepping into territory that could have consequences beyond her understanding. Their whispered conversations added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation. Camilla reached the rope barrier and paused, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she observed Charlotte's continued exploration of the restricted area. The queen consort's breathing became more controlled, a technique she had learned during her early years of adjusting to royal life when media scrutiny and public pressure had often felt overwhelming. This moment required every ounce of that hard-earned self-control. The memorial garden held deep personal significance for Camilla, representing her efforts to establish a lasting legacy within the royal family's environmental initiatives. She had worked closely with horticulturists and historians to create a space that honored both tradition and innovation, carefully selecting plants that would thrive in the changing climate while maintaining the aesthetic standards expected of royal gardens. Seeing Charlotte treat the restricted area as her personal playground felt like a direct challenge to those efforts. Charlotte, meanwhile, had moved toward a section of newly planted saplings that were particularly vulnerable to disturbance. The young trees had been imported at considerable expense from sustainable forestry programs, and their successful establishment was crucial to the long-term vision of the memorial garden. Each sapling represented hours of careful planning and cultivation, making Charlotte's proximity to them increasingly problematic. Thomas Whitfield made a subtle hand signal to his colleague positioned near the main garden entrance, indicating that the situation was escalating and might require additional support. His years of experience had taught him to read the body language and facial expressions of royal family members, and he could see that Queen Camilla's patience was reaching its limits. The security team's primary responsibility was to protect all members of the royal family, sometimes even from each other. The afternoon sun seemed to intensify the colors in the garden, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for the developing confrontation. The contrast between the peaceful beauty of the setting and the growing tension among the people within it highlighted the unique pressures that defined royal life, where even the most innocent actions could have far-reaching consequences for family relationships and public perception. Camilla finally spoke, her voice carrying across the garden with the authority that came from years of royal responsibilities. "Charlotte, you need to come out of there immediately," she said, her tone measured but unmistakably firm. The words seemed to hang in the air, and several nearby guests paused their conversations to listen, sensing that something significant was happening. Charlotte looked up from the memorial stone she had been examining, finally, becoming aware of the attention her actions had attracted. Her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion as she noticed the gathered adults watching her with varying degrees of concern and disapproval. The young princess had grown up in the spotlight, but she was still learning to navigate the complex expectations that came with her position. The queen consort stepped closer to the rope barrier, her composure beginning to show hairline cracks as Charlotte remained in the restricted area despite the clear instruction to leave. "Charlotte, I said come out of there right now. You're damaging plants that took months to establish," Camilla continued, her voice carrying more edge than before. Princess Charlotte's natural independence, a trait that had been both praised and problematic throughout her young life, began to assert itself. Instead of immediately complying with Camilla's instruction, she looked directly at her step-grandmother with an expression that suggested she didn't fully understand why she was being treated like a common rule-breaker. "I'm just looking at the flowers, Camilla. I'm not hurting anything," she replied, using a tone that adults often described as precocious. The use of Camilla rather than a more formal address didn't go unnoticed by the observing guests or security personnel. While family members often used informal names in private settings, the public nature of this exchange gave Charlotte's casual address a different significance. It suggested a level of disregard for the authority and position that Camilla had worked years to establish within the royal hierarchy. Thomas Whitfield recognized that the situation was approaching a critical point. His experience with royal protocol had taught him that family disagreements could quickly escalate beyond what might seem reasonable to outside observers, particularly when they involved questions of respect and authority within the monarchy's complex social structure. He positioned himself more deliberately, ready to intervene if the verbal exchange began to attract unwanted attention from photographers or other media representatives. The other guests in the garden had now largely abandoned their pretense of being interested in other attractions. The unfolding confrontation between the queen consort and the young princess had become the focal point of the entire gathering, with conversation stopping and attention turning toward the restricted garden area where Charlotte continued her defiant exploration. Camilla's face flushed slightly, a sign that her carefully maintained composure was beginning to slip. Years of dealing with media criticism and public skepticism had taught her to control her reactions, but family relationships operated by different rules than public engagements. "Charlotte, you will come out of that area this instant. You're being disrespectful and destructive," she said, her voice now carrying unmistakable anger. The young princess responded to Camilla's escalating tone with her own surge of stubbornness. Rather than moving toward the rope barrier, Charlotte took a step deeper into the restricted area, coming dangerously close to a section of delicate ground cover that had been planted just weeks earlier. Her movement seemed almost deliberately provocative, as if she was testing the limits of her position within the family hierarchy. Thomas Whitfield realized that diplomatic intervention was no longer optional. The security guard stepped forward, knowing that his next words could either defuse the situation or escalate it further. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but family disputes among royals required a delicate balance between respect, authority, and practical problem-solving that no manual could fully address. The atmosphere in the garden had shifted dramatically from the pleasant social gathering that had characterized the early afternoon. Other family members and guests found themselves unwitting witnesses to a confrontation that revealed the complex dynamics and pressures that operated beneath the surface of royal family relationships. The memorial garden, intended to celebrate harmony between tradition and progress, had become the stage for a clash that would test everyone's understanding of respect, authority, and family loyalty. What happened in the next few moments would depend largely on Thomas Whitfield's ability to navigate the treacherous waters of royal protocol while addressing the immediate practical concerns of the situation. His words, chosen carefully from years of experience but delivered in the heat of an unexpected moment, would soon become the most talked about aspect of the entire incident. Thomas Whitfield had served the royal family for over 15 years, protecting kings and queens, princes and princesses through countless public engagements and private moments. He had witnessed family arguments, diplomatic crises, and media scandals, but nothing in his extensive training had quite prepared him for the scene unfolding before him. Queen Camilla's composure was deteriorating rapidly, and Princess Charlotte's defiance was escalating with each passing moment. The security guard understood that his next actions would be scrutinized not only by the immediate witnesses but potentially by the media and public if word of this incident spread beyond the garden walls. Royal protection officers were trained to remain invisible during family disputes, but sometimes circumstances demanded more direct intervention. This was clearly becoming one of those moments. Camilla's voice had risen to a level that was attracting attention from guests throughout the garden party. Her usual diplomatic restraint was being overwhelmed by a combination of personal frustration and institutional responsibility. The memorial garden represented months of her personal investment, and watching Charlotte treated as her personal playground while openly defying direct instructions was pushing the queen consort beyond her limits of patience. "Charlotte, you are being incredibly rude and destructive," Camilla continued, her voice now carrying across the garden with unmistakable anger. "These plants cost thousands of pounds and represent months of work. You need to get out of there right now and show some respect for other people's efforts." Princess Charlotte, rather than being intimidated by Camilla's escalating tone, seemed to be energized by the attention and conflict. At 10 years old, she possessed a natural confidence that sometimes bordered on arrogance, particularly when she felt her independence was being challenged. Instead of moving toward the exit, she deliberately stepped closer to a section of rare orchids that had been specially imported for the memorial garden. The gathered guests watched in stunned silence as the confrontation continued to escalate. Several elderly relatives exchanged worried glances, recognizing that this public family dispute could have consequences far beyond the immediate damage to garden plants. The royal family's reputation depended largely on maintaining an image of dignity and unity, and scenes like this could provide ammunition for critics who questioned the monarchy's relevance and effectiveness. Thomas Whitfield realized that waiting for the situation to resolve itself was no longer a viable option. Both Camilla and Charlotte appeared committed to their respective positions, and the standoff was attracting increasing attention from other security personnel, garden staff, and guests. His radio crackled with quiet communications from colleagues positioned around the grounds, all of whom were monitoring the developing crisis. The security guard took a measured step forward, positioning himself where both the queen consort and the young princess could see him clearly. His movement was deliberate and professional, designed to command attention without appearing threatening or aggressive. Years of training had taught him how to project authority while maintaining the respect due to royal family members, regardless of their age or current behavior. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, addressing Camilla with the formal respect that protocol demanded, "perhaps I could assist with this situation." His voice was calm and steady, cutting through the tension that had built up around the confrontation. He had learned long ago that in moments of crisis, a calm presence could often diffuse emotions more effectively than additional authority or pressure. Camilla turned toward Thomas, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment at how the situation had developed in front of so many witnesses. The Queen Consort was acutely aware that her loss of composure would be remembered and discussed long after the garden party ended, potentially damaging her carefully cultivated reputation for grace under pressure. "Yes, please do something," Camilla replied, her voice tight with frustration. "Princess Charlotte is damaging important plants and refusing to follow basic instructions. This behavior is completely unacceptable, and I expect it to stop immediately." Thomas nodded respectfully to the Queen Consort before turning his attention to Princess Charlotte, who continued to stand defiantly among the restricted plantings. The young princess watched the security guard with a mixture of curiosity and challenge, as if testing whether his intervention would change the dynamics of her confrontation with Camilla. The security guard had dealt with countless difficult situations involving royal family members over the years, from security threats to diplomatic incidents to personal crises. However, disciplining a young princess in front of her step-grandmother and numerous witnesses required a particularly delicate approach that balanced respect for her position with the practical need to resolve the immediate problem. "Princess Charlotte," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of his position while maintaining the respectful tone required when addressing royalty, "I understand that you're interested in the garden, but this area has been restricted for important safety and conservation reasons. The Queen Consort has asked you to leave this section, and I'm going to need you to respect that request." Charlotte looked at Thomas with the calculating expression that royal children often developed early in life, weighing whether this new authority figure represented a different kind of challenge than her ongoing dispute with Camilla. The security guard's intervention had changed the dynamics of the situation, but Charlotte's natural stubbornness was still fully engaged. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Charlotte replied, her voice carrying the defiant tone that had become characteristic of her exchanges with adults who tried to restrict her activities. "I'm just looking at flowers. Nobody told me I couldn't look at flowers in my own family's garden." The logic of Charlotte's position had a certain childish reasonableness to it, but Thomas understood that the practical issues went far beyond simple garden exploration. The restricted area contained delicate plantings that could be damaged by foot traffic, expensive installations that required protection, and symbolic elements that had deep personal significance for Queen Camilla. More importantly, the security guard recognized that this confrontation had evolved beyond questions of garden access into a fundamental challenge to authority and respect within the royal family hierarchy. Charlotte's continued defiance of Camilla's direct instructions was creating a situation that could have lasting consequences for family relationships and public perception. Thomas took another step forward, bringing himself closer to the rope barrier that separated him from the restricted area where Charlotte continued her defiant stand. His movement was calculated to demonstrate his commitment to resolving the situation while avoiding any actions that might be interpreted as threatening or inappropriate toward a member of the royal family. The guests throughout the garden had now largely abandoned any pretense of being engaged in other activities. Conversations had stopped, and attention was focused entirely on the unfolding drama near the memorial garden. Several people had discreetly positioned themselves to get better views of the confrontation, while others seemed uncomfortable with being witnesses to such a public family dispute. The string quartet, apparently sensing the change in atmosphere, had gradually reduced the volume of their performance to barely audible levels. Even the serving staff had slowed their activities, uncertain whether to continue with normal garden party procedures or to wait for the resolution of the crisis that had captured everyone's attention. Camilla stood rigidly beside the rope barrier, her hands clenched at her sides as she watched Thomas attempt to handle the situation that had spiraled beyond her control. The Queen Consort's face showed a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and frustration as she realized that her authority had been publicly challenged and found wanting by a 10-year-old girl. Thomas understood that his next words would be crucial in determining how this incident would be resolved and remembered. The security guard had to balance multiple competing interests, protecting the garden installations, respecting Princess Charlotte's position, supporting Queen Camilla's authority, maintaining royal dignity, and preventing further escalation of an already problematic situation. The afternoon sun continued to cast beautiful light across the garden, creating an almost surreal contrast between the peaceful setting and the intense human drama playing out among the roses and memorial plantings. What happened next would depend on Thomas Whitfield's ability to find words that could penetrate Charlotte's defiance while preserving the dignity and relationships that were essential to the royal family's continued functioning. Thomas Whitfield drew upon every technique he had learned during his 15-year career in royal protection. The moment demanded not just authority, but wisdom that could cut through the stubbornness of a defiant princess while preserving the dignity of all involved parties. He had witnessed countless delicate situations, but few had required such precise calibration of respect, firmness, and diplomatic skill. The security guard looked directly at Princess Charlotte, who continued to stand among the restricted plantings with an expression of determined rebellion. Her small figure seemed almost dwarfed by the larger implications of her defiance, yet her posture radiated the confidence that came from a lifetime of being treated as someone special and important. Thomas had observed Charlotte grow up within the royal family, watching her develop from a curious toddler into an increasingly independent young person. He understood her personality better than most adults outside her immediate family, recognizing both her genuine intelligence and her tendency to test boundaries when she felt her autonomy was being challenged. The security guard also understood Queen Camilla's position in ways that many observers might miss. He had witnessed her years-long struggle to establish herself within the royal hierarchy, working to gain respect and authority in an institution that valued tradition and precedent above almost everything else. This public challenge to her authority struck at the very foundation of the position she had worked so hard to build and maintain. Taking a deep breath, Thomas made his decision. He would speak directly to Princess Charlotte using words that acknowledged her intelligence while making the consequences of continued defiance absolutely clear. His approach would combine respect for her royal status with the practical reality that her current behavior was creating problems that extended far beyond simple garden maintenance. "Princess Charlotte," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of authority but maintaining the respectful tone that protocol demanded, "your grandmother Diana would be ashamed of this behavior." The words struck the garden like a thunderclap. Every conversation stopped, every movement paused, and even the string quartet seemed to falter mid-note. The security guard had invoked the memory of Princess Diana, Charlotte's beloved late grandmother, in a way that was both shocking and strategically brilliant. Thomas had chosen his words carefully, understanding that Diana's legacy held special significance for Charlotte, who had often been told about her resemblance to her famous grandmother and had clearly taken pride in that connection. By suggesting that Diana would disapprove of Charlotte's current behavior, Thomas was appealing to values and expectations that went deeper than simple obedience to authority. Queen Camilla's expression shifted from anger to surprise as she realized the genius of Thomas's intervention. The security guard had found a way to address Charlotte's defiance that didn't rely on Camilla's contested authority or institutional protocol, but instead appealed to family legacy and personal values that Charlotte clearly treasured. Princess Charlotte's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The defiant expression that had characterized her behavior throughout the confrontation dissolved into shock and hurt. Her connection to Princess Diana's memory was one of the most important aspects of her developing identity, and the suggestion that her current behavior would disappoint her grandmother struck at something fundamental in her young psyche. The young princess looked around the garden as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The gathered guests, the damaged plantings, the obvious distress of Queen Camilla, and the serious expressions of the security personnel all suddenly came into focus in a way that her previous defiance had prevented her from recognizing. "That's not true," Charlotte said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence and defiance. The words came out as more of a plea than a statement, suggesting that Thomas's intervention had successfully penetrated her stubborn resistance to authority. Thomas maintained his serious expression as he continued his carefully calculated response. Princess Diana was known for her respect for other people's work and her consideration for those around her. She would never have continued to damage someone else's garden after being asked to stop, and she would never have spoken disrespectfully to family members in front of guests. The security guard's words were having their intended effect. Charlotte's posture began to change as the full implications of her behavior started to sink in. The young princess had been raised on stories of Diana's kindness, compassion, and respect for others, and the suggestion that her current actions violated those principles was clearly having a profound impact. Queen Camilla watched in amazement as Thomas's 9 words had accomplished what her increasingly frustrated attempts at authority had failed to achieve. The security guard had found a way to reach Charlotte that bypassed the power struggle that had dominated their confrontation, instead appealing to values and legacy that the young princess genuinely cared about. The guests throughout the garden remained silent, recognizing that they were witnessing a masterful example of conflict resolution that combined psychological insight with practical problem-solving. Several elderly relatives nodded approvingly, understanding that Thomas had managed to address the immediate situation while potentially teaching Charlotte important lessons about respect and responsibility. Charlotte took a hesitant step toward the rope barrier, her earlier defiance now replaced by uncertainty and dawning recognition of how her behavior might appear to others. The young princess looked toward Queen Camilla with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand the hurt and frustration that her actions had caused. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful," Charlotte said quietly, her voice now carrying the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath her earlier stubbornness. The admission represented a significant shift in her attitude and suggested that Thomas's intervention had successfully broken through her defensive resistance. Thomas nodded respectfully, recognizing that Charlotte's acknowledgement represented genuine progress toward resolving the situation. "I'm sure you didn't intend any disrespect, Princess Charlotte, but intentions matter less than actions and their consequences. The Queen Consort has put months of work into creating this memorial garden, and your continued presence in the restricted area is causing damage that can't easily be repaired." The security guard's explanation helped Charlotte understand the broader context of her actions in ways that the earlier confrontation had failed to communicate. Rather than simply being told to obey orders, she was now beginning to see how her behavior affected other people's work and efforts. Princess Charlotte finally took the decisive step that moved her out of the restricted garden area, ducking under the rope barrier and emerging onto the main garden path where Thomas and Queen Camilla waited. Her movement was careful and deliberate, suggesting that she was now taking the situation seriously in ways that had been absent during her earlier defiance. Queen Camilla's expression softened slightly as Charlotte approached, though the tension and frustration of the past several minutes remained evident in her posture and facial expression. The Queen Consort had experienced a very public challenge to her authority, and, while Thomas's intervention had resolved the immediate crisis, the broader implications of the incident would require time and careful handling to address fully. "I'm sorry, Camilla," Charlotte said, using a tone that was markedly different from her earlier casual dismissiveness. The apology was clearly genuine, reflecting her growing understanding of how her behavior had affected not just the garden but the people around her. Thomas Whitfield stepped back slightly, allowing the family members to continue their conversation while remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. His 9-word intervention had successfully diffused a situation that could have escalated into something much more damaging for all involved, demonstrating the value of experience, insight, and careful word choice in moments of crisis. The garden party gradually began to resume its normal rhythm as conversations started up again and the string quartet returned to full volume. However, the incident had left its mark on everyone present, serving as a reminder of the complex pressures and expectations that defined life within the royal family, where even the most innocent actions could have far-reaching consequences for relationships, reputation, and institutional stability. The memorial garden would eventually be fully restored, and the relationship between Queen Camilla and Princess Charlotte would recover from this difficult moment. However, Thomas Whitfield's 9 words would be remembered long after the damaged plants had been replaced, serving as an example of how wisdom, timing, and understanding of human nature could resolve conflicts that seemed impossible to address through conventional means.